introduce Maricarmen. For me, it's a pleasure always to have Maricarmen as a guest. First, I want to say that Maricarmen is a lecturer in Leiden University, and her interests are around bilingualism, language and contact, code switching, which is, the topic from today is about this topic, dialect syntax, linguistic interfaces, sociolinguistic, and integration of corpus studies and experimental research. Maricarmen had her PhD done in University of Kansas, and she has worked after that in different universities and research institutes. And she has a very vast work with different colleagues from different universities. And in this moment, she is working in 3 important fundings. One, it's on production and processing of lexical analytic versus morphological synthetic strategies in Spanish and English code switching context. And this is a project done together with Belgium and Ohio. She's also working on crossing language borders, in which they are comparing West African and Central America. I think this is in code switching. She will talk about this interesting project. And also she's working together with colleagues in Portugal and Spain on the impact of multilingualism on children's academic and cognitive achievement. I'm mentioning these fundings because this is related to the last research that Maricarmen is taking on. And Maricarmen, so welcome to SELM. Thank you very much for doing this talk. And of course, the cameras are to you. to you.
Yes. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for the nice introduction, Private. I will not be talking about any of those projects because the funding, this is recent funding that we just got, so we are just in the process of hiring PhDs and everything is starting up. So maybe in a year's time or so we'll have something to show. But I'll share my screen now, and let's see.
You remember where it is in share?
Yeah.
Next to. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think it's sharing now. Okay. Okay. Can you see it?
It's appearing. Yeah, it is.
Okay. Okay. Great. So, well, first, the work that I will present today is done in collaboration, a lot of it with Brechje van Osch, who cannot be here with us today, but I wanted to acknowledge that. And what I will try to do today is characterize Papiamento-Dutch code switching, in particular the nominal domain. This is an understudied language combination, and I'll try to connect it with what we know about the nominal domain in other language combinations, right? Okay, so as you probably know, code switching is a phenomenon where multilingual speakers mix their languages within a single conversation or even within a single sentence. Here you have an example of a code switch utterance by a Spanish-Dutch bilingual, for example. And we know that code switching data can offer a very important contribution to our research on multilingualism. We know that mixed language data also permits combinations of formal properties that are hidden in the examination of a single language, such as contrasting word order, which I'll discuss today. And looking at this type of data should help us refine and deepen our understanding of grammatical theory. So the general consensus is that code switching is not a random mix of languages, and that bilinguals have intuitions and regulate where they switch in their speech. So we know that, yeah, it does not happen randomly, and it is rule-governed behavior, like any other type of linguistic behavior. And as you can see in the table here, there has been a wealth of theories and models that have been proposed since more or less the 80s. I don't have time to go into all of them, but today I will discuss some of these models that make specific predictions for the phenomena that I will focus on today. But this is just to give you an overview. So at the same time, we seem to be at the crossroads, what Jacqueline Toribio calls the culture of example and counterexample, right? So while a lot of theories have been developed to explain code-switching data, efforts to account for the empirical findings have faced a lot of theoretical and methodological challenges. And to a great extent, this is due to the fact that available data originate from non-comparable methodologies and also different multilingual profiles and populations. And very limited attention has been paid for two extralinguistic factors that may modulate code-switching behavior. So this makes it very difficult to combine the data and the theories into an integrated account that does justice to both the social and the cognitive aspects of language. And a lot of the work has also been done on Spanish and English, so we need to expand the empirical base. So we have this tension between our theories and our methods, and we need to reconcile this tension by paying attention to describing the diversity attested, paying attention to patterns in variation across communities and also speakers within the communities. And the key issue that I focus on in my research is I think that to understand grammaticality, right, variability is an issue of concern. So what I'm interested in is to see what code-switching patterns are uniform or variable across different communities and language combinations. So this map shows you the language pairs and the locations where the data that I'll show you today has, some of the data I'll show you today has been collected in these different locations. Spanish-English is unique, as I said earlier. A lot of work has been done on Spanish-English because it's available in many different locations from North America, Central America, Gibraltar, etc. But today I will put the focus on Papiamento and Dutch, which is quite understudied. Okay, so going on to Papiamento, it is an Iberian-lexifier Creole, and Papiamento and Dutch have been in a quite complex colonial and post-colonial relationship ever since the 17th century or so. It is the official language of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, known as the ABC Islands, since 2007, alongside with Dutch, which is also official. And there are around 270,000 speakers distributed across the islands and also the Netherlands. And what is interesting is that there is no study of the variation between the islands. So to date, there is a language that is not described to a lot of detail yet. And also, I would like to point out that as well as Papiamento and Dutch, many people in the islands also speak Spanish and English. So it's quite a multilingual region. You can see this in the post that I show you here about physical distancing. You can see that there is English, there is Dutch, then there is Spanish, and then there is Papiamento in there. So quite multilingual. Now, in terms of attitudes, here I show you a typical quote showing both the code switching involved and the speaker's attitudes to code switching. And this is someone from Curaçao. This is from chapter 10 in this Heritage Languages book by Susan Alverse, Albacus, and Peter Muysken. And what you see is that they say, I won't read the Papiamento and the Dutch, but the translation says the use of Dutch words pushes our Papiamento backwards. You see that the Dutch words in the sentence are in bold. So the code switching is marked in there. And ironically, the very utterance illustrates what the speaker is criticizing, right? The code switching. And here, in terms of the Antilleans in the Netherlands, the Antillean community has a very diverse sociolinguistic profile in the Netherlands. They go from long-term residents that are established in the Netherlands, and also students that are there for a short amount of time. But you do hear Papiamentu a lot in the Netherlands. Okay, and it is in fact the 6th most frequently spoken heritage language in the Netherlands, following Turkish, Arabic, Berber, English, and Hindi. Unlike most speakers of these languages, what is interesting is that these speakers, they often are competent in Dutch before they come to the Netherlands because of this colonial past, right? So they are slightly different from the others. Now, there is, as I mentioned, a very limited empirical base on Papiamento-Dutch bilingualism in general. There is now a corpus that was collected already back in 2003, 2004. This corpus has been made available through the MPI database. You have it in there, and a lot of what I'll tell you today is based on this corpus. It's quite small, it's only 3 hours of conversations. This corpus was part of a bigger project, and unfortunately the results have never been published, although I know that Marianne and Peter Indefry are working on it. Unfortunately, Peter Muysken is no longer with us. Yeah, in this project they collected conversational data, but also elicitation data, and other kind of experimental tasks that they're hoping to publish soon now. Okay, so just a bit about this corpus. Has, as I said, 3 hours of conversation of 20 Papiamento-Dutch bilinguals in Nijmegen in this case. They were all habitual code switchers, and on average they speak more or less the same amount of, a bit more Dutch than Papiamento in their daily lives, but we can see that they report more or less almost the same, 6 hours Dutch, 5 hours Papiamento per day. Some of the examples of the switches they found in the corpus include single word insertions, or also adjective noun switches, like what I showed you here, past conducive verb life, have a nice day, etc. What we know so far about the nominal domain is what I'll show you today, and I'll try to connect this to findings of what we know about the nominal domain in other language combinations. And these will be studies that use different methods, and I will not provide much detail on each study. I just want to focus on the big picture. But if you do have questions, we can discuss them later. Okay, so the phenomenon that we are interested in is this switching within the nominal domain. It's widely attested in the literature, often in Spanish English. And it's interesting that in some language combinations, switching within the nominal domain is a potential conflict site. Switching between nouns and adjectives involve a potential violation of the so-called equivalence constraint, where switching is disallowed if the grammars are not equivalent. For example, if adjectives are post-nominal in one language and pre-nominal in the other. Yeah. And an additional observation concerns the language choice of determiners and nouns, in that there appears to be asymmetries in which one of the languages provides the determiner, right? So, for example, there seems to be a preference for Marathi determiners and English nouns, but not the other way around. And these asymmetries have also been reported for Spanish English, as I'll show you in a bit. Okay, so two different theoretical frameworks have tried to account for this phenomenon, and this is just simplifying massively. So on the one hand, there are generativist approaches. On the other hand, we are going to contrast those with the matrix frame approach. So the generativist approach will predict that determiners will come from languages with the most 5 features, such as number, gender, etc. While the matrix language frame approach predicts that the determiners will come from the matrix language, which for our purposes would be the language of the verbal inflection. Regarding adjective position, within generativism, there is a proposal that adjectives should follow the position of the adjective language, and within the matrix language frame approach, the adjectives should follow the position of the matrix language of the verbal inflection. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail. But I want to first start with the language of the determiner, with the asymmetries, regarding the language choice of the language of the determiner. And as I said, this was observed in Marathi English, also in Spanish English. So nominal constructions, mixed nominal constructions like el book, right, with a Spanish determiner and English nouns, have been observed to occur more frequently than the libro with the English determiner and the Spanish noun. And some researchers have taken the libro to be questionable or ungrammatical, even though, as we will see, this is not really what's happening. But one potential explanation for this pattern is the grammatical features spell-out hypothesis by Liceras and colleagues. So they posit that the language with more grammaticized features will determine the direction of the switch. And this is very similar to what Moro proposed. She sees the English determiner as a deficient proof for lexical items from Spanish because it does not have a gender feature that is valuing. And as such, the operation merge will crash, and this would lead to the prediction that English determiners will not be followed by Spanish nouns. So this is an attempt to explain these patterns from this perspective. But Liceras and colleagues and Moro, they didn't take into account the morphosyntactic frame of the clause, and there is an alternative hypothesis, which is the bilingual MP hypothesis, that claims that determiners in mixed nominal constructions should come from the matrix language of the clause, right? And the matrix language, as I said, can be identified by the system morphemes like verbal morphology, also word order, but for our purposes, we are going to determine them with the inflectional morphology now. And under this view, Spanish determiners will then surface in clauses with a Spanish matrix language, and English determiners will surface in clauses with an English matrix language, as we have here in these two examples. So we have my man got de manguera, where we have the verb and the determiner in the same language, and that would be fine. And eso fue en el front desk. Again, we have the verb and the determiner in the same language, and this is what is expected according to the matrix language. So the system morpheme will come from the matrix language. Now, to test these two alternative accounts, we check two corpora from two different bilingual communities a few years back with Margaret Duker and Jeffrey Bloxile. And what we did was we had a corpus Spanish-English from Miami. This is available at Bangor Talk at Bangor University. And then corpus of Spanish-English Creole from the South Atlantic coast of Nicaragua. And the language pairs in the two communities are similar, which will allow us to consider the relative influence of linguistic and social factors on the code switching patterns found, right? And what did we find? Well, after looking at the 35 hours of spontaneous conversation in Miami and compared to what speakers do in Bluefields, Nicaragua, the Nicaragua corpus is 12 hours, we saw that in both Nicaragua and Miami, the determiner and the noun come from the same language in all cases. However, what we saw is that Nicaraguan speakers always produced verbs and determiners from English, inserting nouns from Spanish, and in Miami, the trend was the reverse. Right, verbs and nouns from Spanish with insertions from English, and only a very few cases with English determiners, but also in those cases the verbs were English. So we see the same structural pattern, the verb and the determiner from the same language, but the opposite directionality of switching, right? And this directionality of switching that we observe in production may be explained by social factors, we think. One possibility is that speakers tend to code switch when they are speaking the minority language in that community, which would be the English Creole in Nicaragua and the Spanish in Miami, and insert elements from the language that is more prestigious, which in the case of Nicaragua is Spanish, and in the case of Miami would be English, right? So this is what we know. And together with Marianne Goldberg, then we looked at other language combinations other than Spanish-English to see whether we could find similar patterns. And so here we looked at Welsh English, Spanish English, and Papiamento-Dutch, so Spanish English for the comparative purpose. And yeah, so we had comparable data sets across these 3 different language combinations. And crucially, Spanish, Welsh, and Dutch all have gender. English and Papiamento don't. And just as a reminder, the generativist predictions would expect determiners then from Spanish, Welsh, and Dutch, and not from English and Papiamento, while the matrix language framework would expect a match between the determiner and the verbal inflection. And yeah, as I said, we drew on 3 conversation corpora to compare the speech of bilinguals in these communities. Here's the information. They are all publicly available. Bangor Talk and the MPI Language Archive, now it's also publicly available. So here are the characteristics of the corpus. And let's first look at the distribution of all noun phrases, monolingual and mixed, so simple and also complex. And as you can see, oops, let me see. Yeah, monolingual nominal constructions dominating all corpora. 95% in Welsh English, 97% in Spanish English, 95% in Papiamento-Dutch. And our main focus, however, is the much smaller sample of mixed nominal constructions, which are just basically around 5% of the total NPs in all corpora. And the majority of the mixed nominal constructions are simple, involving just a switch between the determiner and the noun. And then there is a sprinkling of complex ones which also include an adjective, right? But most of them are just a determiner and a noun, as you see there. Okay, so let's start by examining the simple nominal constructions. So for the purposes of analysis, we label the languages as A and B. With A languages, A being Welsh, Spanish, Papiamento, and B, English and Dutch. And this graph shows you the mean proportion of switches between determiners from the A languages and nouns from the B languages. And as you can see, in all corpora, the A-B switches are the most frequent. So in Welsh English, all mixed determiner noun constructions have Welsh determiners and English nouns. In Papiamento-Dutch, you have Papiamento determiners and Dutch nouns, and Spanish English most have Spanish determiners and English nouns. Yeah. So overall, the 3 corpora display the same patterns for this type of mixed nominal constructions, which is very similar to what we observed in Nicaragua and Miami, right? So determiners from A languages, nouns from B languages across the language pairs. And yeah, so as I said, there was consistency. Here are some examples. Remember as well that when we coded for the matrix language was almost exclusively Welsh in the Welsh English dataset, Papiamento in the Papiamento-Dutch dataset, and for bilingual clauses, in Spanish for the Spanish English dataset, right? So this is an asymmetry that we found across corpora. So we observed then this striking asymmetry across language pairs and communities, the co-occurrence of finiteness or verbal inflection in the determiner, which would go against lexicalist approaches such as the ones posed by Liceras and colleagues or more. And the question is, why does this asymmetry surface differently across different pairs and communities? And this could be related to social factors. The matrix language is the minority language, embedding elements from the most prestigious language. And yeah, this explanation will be consistent with the patterns observed in the communities that we studied so far, but it's something that needs to be explored further across other communities. So now I'd like to move to complex nominal constructions that also include an adjective. What order will be chosen if adjective and noun come from languages that impose different orders? That's the question that we are asking. So the target structure here, the complex noun phrase is a potential conflict site. Here is we have Papiamentu, un refresco verde, Determiner-Noun-Adjective, and then Dutch in groen drankje, like in English, a green drink. So this would be Determiner-Adjective noun. So the switches would violate the equivalence constraint, but they do occur in production. And they're not very frequent, but they do occur. Again, here there are competing predictions, and I don't want to get into the theoretical details of the different predictions, but I'll just say that they boil down to the descriptive generalizations that you see on the screen. So on the one hand, within a generativist framework, Canton and Max Swan would argue that the language of the adjective determines whether it appears before or after the noun. And on the other hand, the matrix language framework would see or would predict that adjective noun order will match the language of the finite verb. And see what we have. So again, this is an exhaustive table. The A languages have post-nominal adjectives, so Welsh, Spanish, Papiamentu, and the B languages have pre-nominal adjectives. And as I said, there was a preference for matrix language Welsh, Spanish, and Papiamentu that we need to bear in mind as we interpret this table. And we see that there is a preference for switches between determiners and adjective noun clusters. So this is the ABB pattern. So the determiner is from one language, and then the adjective and noun comes from the other language. And this is followed by a preference by noun insertions. So yeah, this is what we see. So and then the other numbers are very, very low, right? So we see the same patterns with Spanish English in Northern Belize and New Mexico in other work, right? So we see that in production, the actual noun adjective switches are really rare. What we see is a switch between the determiner and then the adjective noun. That's way more frequent. Okay. Let me see, there is an issue with the slide, doesn't want to go forward. I'll try again. Stuck. Oh, no, it did go. Well, those were just some examples of the preferred structures where there is just a determiner from one language and then Belgian loaf or Los Dry Walls, etc. Right? So you see that there is no switch there between the adjective and the noun. Okay, so 3 general observations. We see that mixed nominal constructions are relatively rare, and basically the most common ones are the determinant adjective noun, where the adjective and noun don't have a switch. And then there's some striking asymmetry in the simple determiner noun constructions, where the determiners come from Welsh and Spanish and Papiamentu, with Welsh and Spanish having gender and Papiamentu not having gender, right? So this is what we found in this data. So returning to the predictions, right? What do they mean? For a generative approach, well, we didn't find evidence for the determiners from the language with most 5 features, not in Papiamentu, not in Nicaragua. And we did find evidence that in all language combinations, the determiners will come from the matrix language. Yeah. Now, regarding adjectives, we see adjectives in position of adjective language, and we are not sure what this means for the MLF approach, because we have this, what within the MLF we call the embedded language islands, which are these basically combinations, clusters, where there's no switch between the adjective and the noun. So yeah, the results are rather inconclusive, and perhaps even support the equivalence constraint because there's not much switching between the adjective and the noun. And if we go to previous studies that looked at this switch side, we see that even when different methodologies have been used, like in this study that we did in Wales with Welsh English. We also didn't find very clear evidence, because in our corpus data and in our elicited data, we only got Welsh matrix language, which is the natural language in this population. And to disentangle between the theoretical frameworks, we needed to have English matrix language. And for the grammaticality judgments, they just rejected absolutely everything, because they have a very negative attitude towards code switching. So at that point, Guillaume Thierry convinced us that it would be useful to adopt techniques that would be less prone to the influence of conscious judgments. And we ended up carrying 2 studies in parallel, one with Welsh English and one with Papiamento-Dutch, right? And we were trying to see whether we could be able to say anything about the grammaticality of these noun-adjective switches. Yeah. So we had 40 sets, like the one you see on the screen, of different conditions. This is the design for Welsh English. It was exactly the same for Papiamento and Dutch. And there were 4 conditions with switching and 2 with no switch. And among the switching conditions, 2 in which the 2 models make parallel predictions, B and C, and 2 in which they make orthogonal predictions. And the predictions of the 2 models for these conditions were mutually exclusive. Yeah, so the MLF predicted a violation for D but not A, and Canton and Max 1 would predict a violation for A but not D. Okay, so participants were instructed to read the sentences that were presented on the screen, and then there was a sentence verification task, which picture matches the sentence. And we were predicting an anterior negativity. So I will only give you now the results for the Papiamento-Dutch for the sake of time, but it was very similar for Welsh English. And they're very easy to show you, because basically there was no significant difference between amplitudes, right? Elicited by Papiamento versus Dutch. Well, what does this mean? These are all the comparisons, by the way, that you have in there. I hope you can see them. So the monolingual conditions, and then the 2 comparisons that we did were the the models make orthogonal predictions and the models make parallel predictions, and there was absolutely nothing going on there. So it could mean that code switching is not restricted at modification sites, as was already postulated by De Schulo at some point, or it could be that it's completely disallowed, yeah, as maybe given the production data that we have, yeah, maybe that would lead us to believe that this is what's happening. However, we also realized we had some methodological concerns after doing these 2 papers, because we had, in some conditions, the adjective in sentence final position, which could have led to wrap-up effects. And we also didn't present the conditions in both matrix languages. So Guillaume convinced us to redo the study. And we decided to only do it in Wales, because basically it was a huge struggle to do the first study with Papiamento-Dutch speakers, given that at least our system was not designed to accommodate the curly hair, the hair that is common in Papiamento-Dutch bilinguals. So we decided we wouldn't do it again. But we did do it with Welsh English. And to control for the issues that we were concerned with, we had each condition in the 2 matrix languages, and also added the propositional phrase at the end of the sentence, so that the critical word would not be in final position. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but just highlight some of the more interesting observations of this study, which is that we observed that noun insertions were much easier to process than adjective insertions. And also, we observed something very interesting, which was that when the matrix language was Welsh, sentences that violated the predictions of the models require greater processing effort. And this was not the case when the matrix language was English. So we thought that, well, in the case of the Welsh English community, code switching happens more when the matrix language is Welsh. So this might lead the participants to generate stronger expectations about the placement of the switch. And when the matrix language is English, then such expectations do not apply because this is infrequent, right? It's infrequent for them to mix Welsh into their English. So this highlights, we think, this importance of studying code switching from a language ecological perspective. And yeah, this would support to the claim that processing of code switch structures should reflect context-specific patterns that reveal themselves both in production and in grammatical intuitions, right? So we need to take into account what happens in production as we do studies like this. So back to Papiamento-Dutch. If we were not really convinced that we should be doing another EEG study given our issues before, where we lost a lot of data and a lot of time. So perhaps a different method, right? We were thinking about it, and yeah, we came to Hans that says do not underestimate simple techniques, and we had actually done something with adjective noun switches with Spanish English in the US using yeah, this two alternative forced choice task, and analyzed it with Thurston's measure, which basically places the results of multiple pairwise comparisons into a gradiency scale. And so what we did is we included both matrix languages, and we had so both directions of switches, English and Spanish, Spanish and English, and we had the same conditions that we had in the EEG study. This was for Spanish and English, and we compare all the conditions against each other. And what we see here are just the results, and let me highlight that what we see is that they prefer a noun insertion, right? I like the brown vestido, me gusta el dress marrón, in both directions, right? So this would be the preference. Now, when the adjective is inserted, like in tu, I like the dress marrón, me gusta el brown vestido, then the adjective goes in the position of the adjective language. So we saw these patterns in both directions, and then we thought, let's do this with Papiamento and Dutch. And we did this with a student in Leiden, and we found exactly the same rankings, right? Exactly the same patterns. So again, a preference for noun insertions, and if adjectives were inserted, then the adjective would follow the order of the adjective. But back to production now, and this is more recent work that we are doing in the context of the Heritage Linguistics Lab at Leiden University, where we are focusing at the moment on comparing three heritage languages, Papiamentu, Spanish, and Turkish. And these are my colleagues, so Brechje, Ivo, Denise, Janet, and Bo. And this data that I will show you is part of this paper that is just being accepted and is forthcoming. It could be out any day. And we focus on adjective position in the code switch speech of Spanish and Papiamento heritage speakers in the Netherlands, not on Turkish, because Turkish and Dutch just basically use the same order. Okay, so here is the participant sample. So we had 21 Spanish heritage speakers and 15 Papiamento speakers. Our sample is very diverse, right? And we are aware of this. This was collected during pandemic time, so it was very difficult, but yeah, it's quite heterogeneous, but we are taking into account different variables as well in our analysis. So what we did was a director matched task, and we used this to elicit nominal constructions consisting of a Determiner-Noun-Adjective. And if you are familiar with this task, you'll know that there are two participants, a direction and a matcher, sitting across from each other with a division between them, both with the same set of cards laid down before them. And one participant, which is the director, instructs the other, the matcher, to arrange the cards in the same order as his or her own. And this would elicit nominal constructions. And here you can see the objects that we used on the card. That's where, so we had 15 objects, and we also controlled this for gender because there's another study that looked at gender with the same task, and 4 colors, red, green, black, and white, and no cognates. And the task was played 4 times, first in 2 unilingual modes, Dutch and the specific heritage language, Spanish or Papiamento, and then in the 2 code switching modes, in which they were instructed to perform the task in Dutch, but then name the object in the heritage language or vice versa, right? And we did this to elicit code switching. So now on to the results. So before we look at code switching, it is important to see what these people actually do when they speak each of their languages separately. So here you see what the participants did in the 2 unilingual modes. It is clear that when our speakers are in the Dutch unilingual mode, they almost exclusively use the Dutch word order, and in their respective heritage language unilingual modes, they almost exclusively use noun-adjective word order. You can see this in the graphs. And regarding the location of the switch and the adjective, again, this is what is interesting. We see a lot of noun insertion. So most of our data, if you have language mode Dutch, the noun insertion was Papiamento, and then in 465 of the cases reverted to a Dutch adjective. And you can see this also for Spanish noun insertions and for Turkish noun insertions. When the matrix language was Papiamento, again, the language of the noun would be Dutch, and in 476 of the cases, then the adjective was Papiamento. And when the matrix language was Spanish, again, in most of the cases, the language of the noun was Dutch, and then the adjective was in Spanish. So we see exactly the same pattern that we observed before. And here we see this data visualized in a different way. So in the Dutch mode, here you see that both groups mostly adhere to the Dutch word order, and in the heritage language mode to the other word order. But there is also an interesting difference between the Papiamento speakers and the Spanish speakers, in that the Papiamento are more categorical. And now for the vast majority of the data, as we can see here, the matrix language and the language of the adjective also align, which we can see in the yellow rows, which means that basically these are the cases where the 2 theories make the same predictions. And this is the examples that would match what we saw in other language combinations as well. And those are way more common, right? Okay, so then when Spanish Papiamento is the matrix language, so Spanish or Papiamento, then noun adjective order is preferred for all insertion types, because in some cases we have noun insertions, but in some other cases we also have Determiner-Noun insertions or adjective noun insertions. So here we include all of that, and we see that there's other noun insertions and other insertions. So we see that noun adjective order is preferred for both insertion types when either Spanish or Papiamento are the matrix language, but when Dutch is the matrix language, then noun adjective order is preferred for all other insertions. But for Dutch, noun insertions generally are preferred with adjective noun, and other types are generally noun adjective. Okay. And okay, so when we look at all the individual participants, we also see a lot of variation, right? And you can see this in these graphs, particularly with the individual results for the Dutch matrix language. You can see that the Spanish heritage speakers have a lot of variation, and they also have some within Spanish. So we looked at the experimental mode where Dutch was the intended matrix language, and we saw that there was a significant interaction between age and heritage language. And this is the effect that is illustrated here. So we see that for Papiamentu, child participants prefer noun-adjective, so the Papiamentu order where they code switch into Dutch, but this preference disappears for adults who almost categorically use noun-adjective order. And for Spanish, there is no age effect, so there is more variation, but for all age groups alike. So it seems like Papiamento-Dutch children take some time to converge on the pattern that is used in their community to code switch Papiamento words into Dutch, which is interesting. And also interesting is that when we look at the results for the heritage language mode, we see the opposite. So here we see no age effect of the Papiamento speakers. They realize already from a very young age that when they code switch into Papiamento, they use noun adjective exclusively. But for Spanish speakers, there is an age effect. So the younger the speaker, they use still quite some adjective noun order. Yeah, and by the time they are adults, they converge on the norms that the adults use, which seems to be the noun adjective order. So we see differences here across generations. So yeah, so here is a bit of discussion. We see differences between communities and age groups. For insertions into the heritage language, into Papiamento or Spanish, we see that Papiamento heritage speakers prefer noun adjective more categorically than Spanish heritage speakers, and that Spanish-speaking children take more time to converge on the adult-like pattern. And for insertions into Dutch, we see that Papiamento children take more time to converge on the adult-like pattern in their community. Now, well, the difference between the Papiamento and the Spanish speakers in our study, we think, is not probably related to linguistic differences between Papiamento and Spanish, given that the two languages overlap in terms of word order in the nominal domain. However, there are important sociolinguistic and sociohistorical differences between these communities that may explain this behavior. So the Papiamento community in the Netherlands is bigger, more established, probably more tight-knit, right? And they might interact more among each other. Also, because of what I mentioned earlier, the Papiamento heritage speakers also speak Dutch before they come to the Netherlands. It is possible that language mixing is more common in that community, and that for this reason, there are clearer community norms than in the Spanish-speaking participants. And in terms of the directionality of code switching, what we know from previous research is that Papiamento to Dutch is more common. And this may also explain why in this direction of code switching, the Papiamento speaking children converge on the adult pattern from a very early age, because they are probably exposed to this type of switching more than the Spanish-English children, and also they're more exposed to this than Dutch to Papiamento. And that's why the opposite direction is less common, and this may explain why the children just take more time to converge on what we observe the adults do when they do code switch in that direction. So just to conclude, so in trying to characterize the nominal domain in Papiamento-Dutch code switching, we see that the results on determiner asymmetry and also on adjective and noun order, the results align with previous findings across tasks, communities, and language pairs. We saw that in production, there was a co-occurrence of finiteness and the determiner. This is a linguistic variable that seems to have an effect. And what we also saw was that there is variation in the choice of the matrix language. In the case of Papiamento and Dutch, it is Papiamento, but this varies from community to community, and it will be interesting to see what happens in Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, because in those situations, the choice of matrix language might be the opposite, right? As it happened with Miami and Nicaragua. And in judgments, we again found evidence for exactly the same pattern, independently of the matrix language in this case. Regarding conflict sites, regarding the noun adjective position, again, we found evidence for noun insertions across all the methodologies and all the language combinations we looked at, followed by the adjective in the order of the adjective, right? So this is quite nice, I think, that we found all of this in repeated across different combinations. So what does this mean for our theories? We think that even though these theories have been essential in our understanding of code switching, we need to acknowledge that any theory that focuses on just purely grammatical factors probably cannot be considered an accurate reflection of what happens in reality. And yeah, so we need to perhaps talk about a set of predictors that can have different weights. And it is our challenge as researchers to identify which predictors should be included. Okay, and and estimate the relative weights as along the lines of Peter Muysken. So more data would be needed from the same language pair and across communities. For example, Papiamentu in the ABC Islands, as well as in the same language pair, but between individuals. So more children and adults, more comparisons, because those are really rare in the literature. And by building this stronger and more coordinated evidence base, we can then begin to better understand the nature of multilingual interactions. And hopefully, this will enable us to build better models and theories. And this is, as Fribet said, what we are trying to do now with these new projects, where we are going to do similar data collection across different locations in Africa and Central America and also North America. Okay, so Masadanki, thank you. And maybe I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Maricarmen. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great talk. Yes.
Thank you.
So really informative and complex at the same time. Time for some questions, and I think I have Janine. I don't know, Janine, if you prefer to just say aloud your questions. We can all hear you. You're muted, I think. We can't hear you. Let me see. Now. Oh, no? Sorry, no?
Without
the
a microphone.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed the way in which you investigate the differences between children and adults and how the children slowly learn to adjust to the community norms. Because I think that is a huge gap in the literature on this. We have a lot of data from adults in so many communities, but how do we get to these patterns, right? It's well known also from the book that Peter Muysken published. There are so many differences between different communities in how they code switch. So it cannot just be syntactic variation, right? There must be something in the community that says this is the way how we switch. And I think the fact that you investigated how children adapt to the norms is a huge step forward in our understanding of the variability. So I have lots of other points, but maybe some other people want to come in.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that is actually, I wanted to say we've also done some work looking at gender in Spanish English in Miami and children. That's recent, but there is not a lot of work on children, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Ludo, you have a question?
Thank you. Yes, no, I think I put, oh, sorry, Janine.
Go ahead.
Okay. No, like I seconded to Janine's comments in the chat because I was thinking exactly the same thing. So I really, really like, and also how you embed code switching as an integral part of the bilingual experience, right? So the only thing I was wondering, because you showed us earlier, for example, in these mixed code switch DPs, that actually the vast majority, about 95%, were single language DP. So so do you think that so it's a small, it's like 5%. So do you think it's enough evidence then for these? I mean, you would argue probably yes, looking at the differences between the Dutch Papiamento and the Spanish speaking children. And I was just wondering again whether for the Spanish speaking children there may be a lot more wavering between some sort of, I don't know, cross-link co-activation between the two languages and really not knowing which way to go in a way, sort of, you know, kind of cross-linguistic influence kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I think there is some of that. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a huge number of children either in the, you know, our numbers are very low. So this is just the beginning. But yeah, I mean, the 5% of all switch DPs, it's kind of, if you look at bigger corpora like the Bangor Miami corpus, or even this corpus that Osmer Balan has of bilingual speech in Belize, it seems to be around that. You know, if you look across all corpora, and in Belize, the determiner and the noun also coincide. And there he extracted, because his corpus is quite big, over 4,000 nominal constructions that were switched out of the total amount of switched nominal constructions. So I'm not sure if you were talking about this, the evidence for the match, or...
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, like, you know, so you were saying, so these children seem to be converging on the way in which the adults code switch, you know, so it is okay to do this type of code switching. At the same time, they don't have a huge amount of, you know, that they're not that frequent. So I'm just wondering, and who knows, I mean, it's an empirical question. What is the minimal threshold? Maybe these are more salient because they're actually not in the same language. So maybe you're more drawn to something that is salient because it is, you know, you're using two languages at the same time. So it strikes you a little bit more because that's not what you're expecting. Maybe that's enough.
Yeah, I mean, what I can tell you is that for the study we have done with Spanish English children in Miami with gender, this was, so in Spanish English in Miami, when they switch between a determiner and a noun, not only the determiner comes from Spanish normally, it's also masculine. Right? So they don't use feminine determiners in code switching. In the adult. But we were looking at what do children do, and what we saw is that by age 7, our children were 7, and we didn't have any younger children. When they were speaking in Spanish, they would use el and la, and when they code switch, always el, always masculine. So by age 7, they had acquired that community norm, which was interesting, but we don't have earlier data. So so at least for those children, it was enough to not only acquire the determiner, but also the gender, you know, pattern.
That's great, very interesting.
Yeah, but it's a very good question about what the threshold would be. And it would be nice to
like
see.
I said, you know, I think code switches are more salient anyway, because you know, you detect something that is not what you would normally have. Thank you.
Maricarmen, I also would like to read what Janine wrote, because it's something that we haven't mentioned. She said, there is some evidence against the generativist approach from Turkish-German code-switching data, where German insertions into heritage Turkish are much more frequent than the other way around.
This is from your own work, right, Janine? Or
yes.
So,
you know, you would expect, if next one is right, that a German noun that is looking for a gender in the Turkish heritage grammar is not going to be able to play a role in a Turkish sentence because it can't find a gender there, right? But you get massive insertions of German words into Turkish, despite the fact that Turkish doesn't have gender. So it may work beautifully for Spanish English code switching. If you get the example, el house is okay, but mi casa is not. But I mean, it doesn't work for other languages. And one of the reasons is, in my view, it's just simply because if people are being asked to give a judgment on this, what they do is they reflect what they hear in their environment. And so you hear far more English nouns in Spanish sentences than the other way around. So if you are being asked, is this grammatically correct? Then you say, oh, well, actually, I don't hear so many Spanish nouns in English, so I'm going to say no, right? So these judgments, they can't reflect just the syntax. It's not possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. And I should also say that we've done these judgments with Spanish English in the US. And if you embed the mixed nominal construction into a clause, which usually Max 1 didn't do, then whenever there is a determiner from English followed by a Spanish noun, if it is embedded into an English morphosyntactic frame, then they accept it. They have no problem with it. So it's just going beyond the DP and taking into account the rest of the clause, and then the judgment changes. And we have this for this evidence for grammaticality judgments. Yeah.
And the one thing that could also play a role in all of this is semantic specificity, right? What Buckley said in 2003. When you have a noun that comes from another language and you use that code switch, it's likely to have a very high degree of semantic specificity, because you're looking for a term for which there is no lexical equivalent in your other language, right? Whatever I'm thinking of the German words right now, but you know, compound words for your ability to stay in a country, right? So Aufenthaltsberechtigung in German, right? That's the word you have if you want to stay in a country and you get permission to indefinite leave to remain, right? That's it, indefinite leave to remain. So you're going to get that expression. Well, you can't have that expression in Turkish to hand, so you're going to use it because it's a highly semantically specific thing for which there's no equivalent. So that could also play a role in the grammaticality judgment if you take a noun or a compound or whatever and insert it into another language. So I wonder if that's something that you could add to all the analysis that you've made. If people are, if you have house, it's not very semantically specific, right? But there could be some examples in your data set that are very semantically specific, and they might be more accepted than the ones that are very generic. Just an idea, not pretty, just an idea.
No, yes. Thank you. That makes sense.
And Maricarmen, I think we are already on time, but I have to, although we are running off time, sorry.